Synchrogistics LTL Claims Index. We're joined by 4 leading people who helped build this index. We have Bill Jackson, who is the founder of Synchrogistics. We have Gabby Slowly, who is the director of analytics. We have Max Cartwright, who is the logistics data analysis. And we have Elena Slocum, who is our senior legal specialist. So we're just going to have a discussion about what our data shows, what it doesn't show, and why the index is so important for our shippers, carriers, and anyone moving freight. So, Bill, what was the motivation behind building the Synchrogistics Claim Index?
Well, we know that claims are a huge part of shipping, but they're unpredictable in many ways. Claims impact every LTL shipper, but to me, it's always been shrouded in mystery. I've been working in LTL now for over 2 decades in this space, and I've never seen a consolidated picture of what a normal claims experience is for a shipper. So the Synchro Claims Index is designed to fill in that gap and ideally let our customers know whether their claims experience is in line with the market or not.
All right. Can you go into a little bit more detail about how the index was created?
Yeah, absolutely. So we reached out to a lot of carriers, and we were able to gather information from around 20 carriers on their claims performance. Now, from there, it was a matter of our analytics team going in, Max included, of cleaning up the data a little bit, right? When you're coming up with an index, it's so crucial to make sure that the data is comparable and consistent period over period. So for that reason, whether carriers just weren't able to get us the information we needed, we ended up, as Max will mention later on, with 11 carriers in the index. And for the methodology, what we went with was a weighted averaging methodology for coming up with the index. So taking all of these carriers' claims ratios and then weighting them accordingly. Now, when it gets into the actual claims ratio, I'm going to take a moment here to get a little bit technical because it's important for a lot of the discussion that we'll have later on. A lot of times when shippers think claims ratio, and also a lot of times 3PLs, when you think of, oh, well, what's my claims rate? What's my claims ratio? You're thinking of claims incidents. So how many claims happen divided by how many shipments were there. You had 1 claim filed out of 100 shipments. Now, what the carriers tend to report and what they call the claims ratio, that is based on dollar amounts. It's kind of like a financial measure. So it's the total amount paid out on claims divided by their total revenue. So if I had $100 in revenue and I paid out $1 in claims, then that's how you would get a 1% claims ratio. So comparing that to the incidence rate, which oftentimes is what people think about. So we gathered all of this information on claims ratios, and that's how we were able to consolidate all of this information together into a usable representative sample that is consistent and comparable quarter to quarter. Now, that's not to say we wouldn't love to add more carriers to it in the future. If we're able to work with carriers to get that information to make it even more solid and more representative, we would love to do that.
All right. Thank you, Gabby. So why is the claims index useful for shippers and carriers?
Well, part of LTL shipping is educating shippers about claims. Like I said, it impacts every shipment, but it's very unpredictable. Synchrogistics, in our experience, we've helped our clients achieve lower claims than the industry average, but it's hard for us to show how well we're doing because there's not a standard that's out there. So we decided to create this index to establish the standard, pull together disparate sources of information so that for us, we can show how well our clients do, but in general, to help the overall space for carriers and shippers to have a standard to measure against. And we think that's going to be very useful for the space.
So Max, you helped pull the data. What's something in the data that surprised you?
Yeah, for me, what was surprising was that there's this very clear downward trend industry-wide in the claims ratio. So we didn't see, for example, one particularly large carrier with a downward trend that was just dragging the entire index down. For just about all of the 11 carriers that we tracked over this 4+ year period, it seems that most of them, they're showing a pretty sharp and clear downward trend in the claims ratio over this time period. And I found that surprising and maybe even a little bit concerning.
So how did inflation play into the role in the data?
Yeah, I can take that one. So sorry, I'm getting a call. Okay. So that actually, if you think about the claims ratio, there's two parts to it, right? There's how much is being paid out on claims, and then there's your revenue, right? And so if you have a situation where the amount that you're paying out on average per load or per claim is staying level, but because of inflation, your revenue is naturally going up, that can actually bring your claims ratio measure downwards, even though it's not necessarily tied to how many claims you're having.
So, Elena, how have you noticed that carriers' claim practices have changed over the last few years?
Certainly, we've seen, a tightening up of the claims process. There's a lot more stricter adherence to different tariffs and rules. Amongst the carriers, we're seeing definitely an increase in that, and them, only wanting, to handle claims according to, those particular guidelines. And I think that that's definitely a reaction to, not only inflation and the, tightening of the market, but also, just an increase in fraud, an increase in theft. So all of those things create an increase in claims. And so, of course, both carriers and their insurance companies are looking for ways to mitigate the increase in the claims. So you're going to see them really drilling down and, being tougher in their evaluation of claims and what their value is.
All right. So how can shippers better protect themselves from denied and reduced claims in the future?
The top three things that they can do are prevention, proactive documentation, and timely filing. Prevention, obviously that's making sure that they are properly packaging, particularly with LTL because of the NMFC codes. There are certain things that they have, certain ways that certain products have to be packaged. So they really need to make sure that they, are adhering, to both the NMFC and NMFT codes, that they, are having everything packaged properly. You can't, if you have something that is improperly packaged and it gets damaged, that is grounds for denying the claim, under the rules. And, they also need to make sure they're giving very clear instructions about if the freight requires special handling, if you can't use a forklift on it to load and unload, things of that nature. With reefer, type shipments, have to be very clear about the temperatures, what they need to be set at, if it needs to be continuous or cycle, that type of thing. Proactive documentation, just making sure that they have all their documents in order, the BOL, the POD, sales invoice, packing list, inventory list, that type of thing. Just having that documentation ready to go if there is a claim makes everything go so much smoother. And then timely filing, just making sure that once those shipments are delivered, that they're being inspected, quickly, because particularly with concealed damage claims and with shortage claims, we have to give them notice of those within 5 days. So just making sure that everything is done in a timely manner so that we can get those claims filed, the sooner the better, because the sooner you get it filed, the easier it's going to be to get it paid.
And one thing, Elena brought up carrier practices, and I think it's something that we can address. Maybe we could have done it in the inflation piece, but it's important to realize that while there's been general inflation in the industry, a lot of the limits of liability that carriers keep have remained the same, have not kept the same pace of inflation. So when Gabby was talking about the calculation of the claims ratio with the claim and the revenue, the claim value and the revenue, the reality is that claim value is bounded in many cases at the top end by the limitations of liability. So you're naturally going to potentially have the same claims rate. It might be 2 shipments per 100. You might have that same rate, but you can only claim, a maximum of $200 on a shipment, no matter what. So even though the cost of that shipment, of the freight has gone up, X percent per year, you're going to show a declining slope simply by the math of the fact that the limitations are not keeping pace with the inflation.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. So, Gabby and Max, when you guys were pooling the data, what were some of the limitations that you guys found in this project?
Yeah, I think one of the big limitations is that, claims ratio is different from the claims rate, which Bill brought up. So claims rate being the percentage of shipments resulting in claims. The claims ratio doesn't necessarily give you an idea of what the claims rate actually is. Now, as an end user, as a shipper, the claims rate is maybe a number that's a little bit more digestible, right? If I'm working with a carrier and they tell me, well, 5% of their loads result in a claim, I say, okay, well, 5 out of 100 loads result in a claim. So if I ship 100 loads with you, on average, I'm going to file 5 claims. Maybe that's a problem. So that number, it's a bit more digestible. And again, the claims ratio is not necessarily giving you an idea of what the claims rate is. Now, as Elena alluded to, and I kind of talked about this earlier with declining claims ratio being maybe a bit of a problem or a bit concerning. So you would think maybe on the surface, a high claims ratio would mean that carriers are lower quality, and a low claims ratio would mean that they're higher quality, right? They're not getting as many claims, but that's not necessarily true. So again, as Elena talked about, it's entirely possible that these carriers are just making the claims process way more difficult, and they're putting these like hard caps on how much they're willing to pay out on claims. And that's why we're seeing this declining trend in the claims ratio. So we just have to be a little bit careful by looking at the claims ratio and, coming to conclusions about any improvements or changes in, the quality of service that these carriers have given over time.
Yeah, and kind of to piggyback off of what Max said, there's so many things that go into the claims ratio calculation that aren't claims incidents, like the claims incidence rate. So you have the policies going on, you have the general cost of freight, but then you also have things like, a good example would be if a carrier had policies where they did allow them to pay more out on a claim. As a shipper, that's actually a good thing, right? I submit a claim and you're willing to pay me more back. But that would actually negatively affect their claims ratio because they're paying out more than, say, carrier B, who puts a hard cap in place. So, the interpretation of the data, this is still really groundbreaking, the fact that we were able to gather all of this information and present it in a consolidated manner. But you just have to keep those caveats in the back of your mind when you're interpreting the data.
So, what kind of impact could this have on the way that the industry starts to talk about LTL claims?
I think as we've pointed out, carriers are showing a declining curve, and that implies improved claims performance. But we've shown much of that downward slope is due to policies and things that are outside of an improvement in the incidence rate. So I think the impact in the long run would be to put more pressure on carriers to present the claims incidence. And from that, shippers can make better business decisions about the carriers they use and the value that they're getting.
Yeah, 100% agree.
All right.
Absolutely.
So what are the next steps and how will this be used in the future?
Well, I think the next step here is to get the word out. We're gonna disseminate this information. We invite feedback. It is the first of its kind out there, and we're very excited about that. Ultimately, as you know, a business owner that's heavily involved in the LTL space, I feel that my team, as you can see here, we're very knowledgeable, have industry best practices. But I feel that it's hard to differentiate because so many shippers don't, through no fault of their own, don't understand the claims process. And so I want this transparency and visibility to be out there so that my amazing team can get the credit and show the value that they're actually bringing to our shippers, to our customers.
Well, thank you guys. It's been great to hear everyone's feedback, and I'm excited to see where the LTL freight claim will go in the future. So I appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.